Welcome to the podcast for Healing Neurology, where we talk about everything that can help heal your neurology, which is really everything from food, lifestyle, and medicine to nature, culture, and politics. There's no topic too big or too small. I'm Jillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine. And we have an incredible guest on the show for you today. Shortest bio ever. I think there's such power behind it. Karyn Schwartz is a community herbalist and owner of Sugar Pill, a small apothecary in Seattle, Washington. That's it. That's her bio. And as we were, messaging back and forth about getting set up for the show, it's kind of like we're talking about plants. We're talking about plant medicine. And I was just feeling like Karyn is kind of like a plant bio would be like grew here, transferred photosynthesized sunlight into oxygen. And I feel like that's what Karyn does. She is that magical. So we're going to have a whole conversation today about herbalism and about plants and about why that relationship is important between plants and people, between the earth and people. So Karyn, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is awesome.
Yeah. So let's dive in. Like, what's herbalism? What is that?
Herbalism is so many things. I mean, I think at its simplest form, like if you're interacting with plants in any way, you are doing herbalism. If you are cooking with plants in your kitchen, you're doing herbalism. If you're making tea out of something, you're doing herbalism. If you're sitting and listening to the grass, that you're doing herbalism. There's so many ways to have relationships to plants, and we are bound to them. So we're always in relationship to plants. I mean, like you said with your poem, there's no oxygen without plants. Mm-hmm. So we're not here unless we're in relationship to plants. And I think before we even talk about the consumption of or the utilization of plants, just to recognize that we are wholly dependent on the plant world for our existence. We just start from there, and all of life is informed by plant life, all of it.
That's so interesting. So if you're a listener, if you're part of our audience and you're interested in vegetables and you eat vegetables, then you're an herbalist.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. If you've eaten a salad, you're an herbalist. If you threw some oregano into a pot of stew, you're an herbalist. Absolutely.
So like if you have some basil on your pizza, you're an herbalist. If you have lettuce on your cheeseburger.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've been really thinking about a lot, and as I get older, I feel like things simplify more and more, And I think sometimes about how I met different plants. So you just mentioned basil. When I was in college, I was working with a catering company, and every summer we had to make pesto to put up for the rest of the year. And so this one summer, it was my job to pick all of the basil leaves off of the stems to prepare for the pesto. And after a day of doing this, I went home and I was giddy, like laughing and sort of ecstatic in this way that I was like, what is going on? And, I was in college. I was probably indulging in some other plant sorts of things at that time in my life, but I'd never felt anything like that. It was just pure joy. And I didn't really think about it, but I went to work the next day and I had to spend a whole other day picking basil again. And what was happening was the oils from the basil were getting into my system through my fingertips. And basil is an incredibly joyful plant. It's not a mistake that people feel happy when they eat basil. It's an enormous antidepressant, exultant. I mean, it's such a powerful plant, and we eat it all the time and we don't think about it. But I kind of OD'd on it that day, and I was like, oh, wow, like that's what this plant is capable of. That's its language. That's its love language. And I started approaching plants in a different way at that point in my life, because I realized that all I had to do was listen. I was starting to read books back then, and I was starting to teach myself, and I was making some really awful things based on my experimentations. But then I realized I've been doing that all my life. I grew up under a giant chokecherry tree, and the first thing I ever tried to do as a budding herbalist was make ink out of chokecherries, and my mom was furious. There was just chokecherry juice everywhere. But I was just so enamored by all of these beings around me that seemed to have this life force of their own. And it wasn't until later on that I started really delving into it. And I never intended to, quote unquote become an herbalist, but it was the through line to everything else that I did. Like, it was always this side thing that I did because I loved it. And, you know, I'm 55 years old now, and then that's what I'm doing. Like, that's what I've been doing all my whole adult life. It was the thing that kept sticking because it stayed interesting, and it stayed life affirming, and it stayed accessible, and it became this language for me to share all of the other things I was learning with people who were coming to me for help.
So then how did you go about learning more?
Well, for a while it was just self-study, and I was working as a cook. So I was learning culinary plants. And then I worked in the field of social work for some time, and I was pretty disturbed at how much suffering there was that was being untreated. And by untreated, I mean it was not even recognized, that people were being given prescriptions to control all kinds of things, but there wasn't any opportunity to stop and heal or just listen. And so I decided to go to massage school because I needed an out, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to go farther down the track that I was on. And when I was in massage school, I learned about aromatherapy, and I learned about anatomy. I actually learned more about nutrition in massage school than my sister did in medical school. Yeah, I learned about hydrotherapy and kinesiology and all these very basic things about how the body functions. And I thought, why don't we all know this? Why aren't we taught this in high school health classes? Like, this is part of you. This is how it works. This is what it does. How about you take care of that, you know? And so I just got real curious about that. So when I started my massage practice, I got a job on the side in an herbal apothecary, and I just started listening to people. You know, people would come to the counter and ask me for an ounce of this and an ounce of that. And I was like, cool, I will weigh that out for you. What are you going to do with it? And I would just interrogate my customers. And I also listened to the people who were standing next to me. And I got real lucky because my first job in an herbal apothecary, I was surrounded by people with so much knowledge. And I just got to listen to them. And I just absorbed it the way you would absorb a language if you moved to a different country. And I just learned it by doing it. And I think that I had enough, what's the word? I maybe humility, but maybe fear. I had enough of both of those things to know when to say, I don't know, and to not try to suggest anything that I didn't really feel confidently was safe. I also had the misfortune to have a coworker who prescribed things frequently that he didn't know what he was talking about, but it made him feel important. So I learned that lesson too, what it looks like when you get ahead of yourself. So I just had this amazing sort of hands-on training, and then that made me more curious, you know. So I started going to herb gatherings, and I would go to, you know, classes that were available. And if I found a teacher that I really resonated with, I would kind of hurl myself at them and be like, can I hang out with you? And
Amazing.
Coming up, right? And at the time I was coming up, like, Seattle was actually a pretty livable city back then. So there wasn't so much pressure to make so much money. And so I had more time. So I was lucky. I had time to spend with people. I had time to experiment. I had time to listen and learn and concentrate on things in a way that I think if I was starting now, I'm not so sure I would have that same opportunity. So I feel really lucky that I started when I did. I
still see, you know, I have patients who are along these tracks of sitting with teachers and going places for teachers, but it's outside the city these days. You know, it's hard to be in such an expensive place and try to and be listening, you know?
Yeah.
Amazing. And so if that's herbalism, I'm just trying to think, what have you seen be the obstacles for us kind of as a culture to listen better to plants? I think that as a culture, we don't listen to anything very well. You know, and especially as things keep speeding up technologically, and entire generations of people have been accustomed to looking things up on your phone because it's right there in your hand all the time, rather than sitting still and taking a deep breath and wondering. Yeah.
about something, you know? I mean, it's funny. I feel like I'm at this age now where I'm like, when I was younger, you know, but when I was a kid, like we didn't have computers. I didn't have a TV. Like we had trees. And, you know, it's not like I grew up in the country. Like I grew up in a shitty suburb, but that's what we had. We had a little shitty backyard and some trees, and we had to use our imaginations and make up something to do to keep us occupied.
Yeah.
And I think you learn how to solve problems differently when you find a quick answer. And also, you know, I had some challenges in my life that required me to do some pretty deep healing. And so I learned as well from my own experience that things don't change quickly, and they don't change unless the fundamental reason for discomfort or dis-ease are worked with in some way. And somehow I think I understood all along that there's always a story. You know, there's nothing that happens in a vacuum. And for me, I know that my own physical challenges growing up and the emotional backdrop to that were so intricately connected. And I had some very stubborn physical symptoms that Western medicine never could really address. And I got stronger and stronger and stronger prescriptions for those things until my body couldn't handle the prescriptions anymore. So at the same time that I started really wondering about plant medicine, I mean, part of why I was wondering about it was because when I moved to Seattle in the late 80s, and I was, you know, fresh out of college and wondering what to do with my life, I was also pretty well disabled by this physical situation that I was in. And one of the first people that I met when I moved to Seattle was an herbalist, and she had a garden, and she had knowledge, and she had time. And she kind of took me under her wing. And it wasn't like then everything got better and everything went away. But what happened inside of me was that I felt hopeful for the first time that something would change.
Yeah.
And from there, I sought out other alternative healing. And the way that people talked to me and the way that people asked me questions was such a relief that in and of itself, that was healing. You know, before anybody ever gave me a prescription of a plant or something specific to eat or not to eat or whatever other remedies people suggested for me, it was the way that people talked to me and were curious about, why do you think this is happening? What do you think this is connected to? And they they gave me the opportunity to do that inquiry and to do that work myself and to put together the pieces of the puzzle. Like, this is why your body is yelling at you this way. It's trying to get your attention because something else needs to be healed. And when that shifts, then your body doesn't have to keep doing this thing that it's doing to get your attention.
It's reminding me, there's a book called The Spirit Level. I don't know if you know this book it's written by two British economists, which to me sounds like it would be really boring, but it's all about inequity, how inequity essentially is stressful and causes early mortality, increased anxiety, depression, and that when you compare the 30 richest nations in the world, along with when you compare the 50 states in the US against each other, every time there's greater inequity, we see worse health outcomes, worsening health status. And the last chapters of the book, they talk about celebrities and celebrityism, and that, you know, we humans find safety in community. And so if we know rich people or famous people, then there's some element of assumed safety that will somehow be protected. And so that we've become obsessed as we feel less and less safe, we become more and more obsessed with what celebrities are doing and imagining that us knowing them somehow means that they will know us and keep us safe. And it's so interesting as you're talking about it, because in the medical world, you know, if you have a urinary tract infection, you take an antibiotic, and there's no relationship with really even the antibiotic or the clinician who prescribes it. It's just if A, then B. If A condition, then B remedy. And on the flip side, we have all this obsession with celebrities and money and fame for safety. But what I'm hearing you talk about is that getting to know plants like threads the needle between all of those things. So it's not only developing a relationship with a plant like you did with basil, but also a community of understanding the characteristics of the plants, but also understanding how spending time with the people who know them and getting to know yourself. So it's a totally different triad.
Yeah. You know, I didn't grow up with this, and
Huh.
there is an element to my practice that it will never go beyond a certain depth, because I wasn't raised in a tradition of herbalism. I didn't grow up
Huh.
knowing a landscape. I,
Mm.
I, I definitely have ancestral relatives who were herbalists. My great grandma, no doubt, was an herbalist. She came over
Mm.
here from, escaping whatever shenanigans was happening in Russia at the time that she fled.
Uh-huh.
And the first thing she did was plant a garden. And my relatives argued all throughout my childhood about what the hell was in great grandma's garden and, what was going on back there. But it wasn't passed on to me. The language wasn't passed on to me. I think there are entire systems of healing that are intricately woven into the understanding of landscapes and nature cycles and the language that evolved around that. And every indigenous culture has that. And as we've gotten away from our own cultures and we've, destroyed other cultures, a lot of that has gotten lost. And I think that there's this deep longing in most people for something that feels, what you're saying, is safe, because your basic nourishment, your basic well-being, your basic need for food and shelter and a sense of belonging and comfort and being enveloped by all of that. I think that there are still languages that reflect that, and there are still keepers of that tradition in indigenous cultures that have that. But for most of us, it's still elusive, because we've been separated from it. So I think as kids, there's something innate in us that wants to connect in that way. I think that, you see this wonder in kids' eyes. Just, it's like every day is an acid trip when you're a kid. Like, what is that?
Yes.
How many shades of green are there? And is that cattail talking to me? Because it is.
Yeah.
But we don't know how to talk about it. All of us have language for that. So we lose it as we get older. And I think that reconnection in and of itself is so healing. So if somebody provides the space for you to reconnect to nature and gives you permission to, actually go hug a tree. I had a really traumatic back injury about 13 years ago, and I couldn't walk for probably about 6 months.
Oh, wow.
And there were times when my longing to just be outside and to move my body through space was so intense. And all I could do was get myself outside and lean against the tree. So that's what I did, and I would try to imagine, like, well, here's this tree with all this life going through it. Like, what if that vibration could help? And it did. It was like I would feel less anxious. I would feel more peaceful. I would feel less frightened for that bit of time. And I wasn't consuming the plant. I wasn't cutting anything down or taking snippets or making tea. I was just sitting there breathing with it. There's a lot to be said for that energetic exchange, again, before you even start consuming something or taking something from nature, just being there.
Just being with nature. So far, what we've talked about makes you an herbalist is being in close physical proximity to a live plant or eating it on your plate in any shape or form. These are pretty accessible.
Yeah.
When we talk about how do we perhaps disengage from celebrityism or re-engage and reconnect and to find safety in a more sustainable place, it might be just walking outside or spending a few more minutes outside or a few more minutes listening to plants or trees or a few more minutes thinking about your vegetables.
I know I keep skirting this in a way because there's so many things to talk about. So I'm going to talk about one more thing that's not about plants or herbalism, but I think you'll resonate with it because of the work that you do. I remember reading something about, it was about ADHD and kids and how to quote unquote treat that. And there was a study, and I don't remember where I read this, so I don't know who did it, but there was some sort of a study that had to do with essentially just lifting your eyes and looking out on the horizon. Instead of being so focused on what's right in front of your face, which of course, if you're holding a handheld device is right in front of your face, to actually put that device down and go for a walk and then look up at the horizon. And they likened that to the need to scan your horizon to see if something was coming towards you that might be threatening. And this instinctual thing that, creatures have to look around and see if there's a predator and see if there's a threat. And that if you can look around and see that nothing is there, it assuages your anxiety that something bad is about to happen. And they were suggesting that because we're not using our long vision, that our level of anxiety is heightened because instinctually we are hardwired to want to scan the environment and see if something is dangerous. But if we never look out there, we kind of never know. And then this anxiety builds up. And so I started just doing this practice myself and also recommending it to young people with attention problems and anxiety disorders to just for 20 minutes a day, just look around, look around and look up and look past where you can see something that's close and just see how it feels. And it works. It works. We're animals, we're supposed to be outside interacting with the environment. And that need doesn't and should not go away.
Yes.
So, I don't know how many studies we need to show that if kids are allowed to go outside and play, they learn more and they're calmer and they feel better about themselves. We can prove that over and over again in double-blind studies. But why is this? Why is it a surprise if you have your basic needs met that you're happier? Why is it a surprise that if you have a sense of belonging and community and that there are other people who've got your back, why is it a surprise that that's good for you?
Yes.
We're so endlessly surprised by these expensive research projects that we seem to need to prove to ourselves that what's basic actually works.
And so can you talk to us a little bit about how herbalism traditions are, what's the same and kind of what's different around the world?
Wow, I mean, that's a pretty big topic that I wouldn't claim to be any authority about, but I would imagine that what's the same is that everywhere there are people, there are plants. So everywhere that there are people, plants were being used for food and medicine. Not to be cheeky, and seen, everywhere on the earth that cultures evolved, they evolved along with their food and medicine plants. And so I think that what's true is that there was no separation of medicine and nourishment and culture, that they were interwoven, and that for sure there have been keepers of that knowledge and there have been people entrusted with that knowledge, and that probably in most cultures the people who were mentored in those arts were chosen for a reason, and that there is a calling, I think, that you have, an initiation into the ways of medicine, that it's not something that you take lightly if you're going to hold that responsibility for the well-being of your community, but that there also wasn't so much separation, that most people would have some basic knowledge of plants, and that maybe other ones were reserved for the people in the community who were going to hold that role. And, obviously, so many of the medicines that we use today have evolved from people's knowledge of plants in different areas. So I think that the through line of forever in time has to do with the way that plants were understood to be helpful and medicinal. I think what Western science has been able to do is to take apart the plants and look at, specific constituents, specific chemicals that the plants make to protect themselves or heal themselves or communicate. So we know on a more granular scientific quote unquote level now what those plants are doing. But I think because there's so many different ways of knowing things. I mean, I sometimes I'm just so blown away by the fact that ancient traditions of medicine have survived, that they're so powerful and they're so complete in a way, and they address things that our modern knowledge can't address because they're intertwined with our understanding of the elements and the seasons and different influences. And you know, the idea of complementary medicine to me is still so seductive that wouldn't it be amazing if we really could marry traditional and indigenous and ancient knowledge, like, but really marry it, not just pick and choose the parts we want.
Right.
You know, I mean, you used the word celebrity before, and I think there's something happening in natural medicine that is so disturbing, that there are celebrities within those communities. And there's also this incredible and very Western desire for what's exotic and what's sexy, you know, and what's magical and what's the next rare thing that I can get my hands on that's going to change my life because I got this thing, you know. And it's interesting, as you know, I call myself a community herbalist, and I really mean it. Like, I have situated myself within a community, and I'm that lady. I'm there on that corner all the time, and you can ask me questions, and there's only so much that I know, but I'll share it with you because I feel like we should all know this. And I find myself over and over again talking people out of the latest exotic thing for a couple of reasons. One is, we have plenty of magical things here. You're just not interested in it because it's basic and you already know about it.
Yeah.
Blueberries are freaking awesome. Why don't you just eat them instead of like stealing the food from some other part of the world? Like, just eat what we have here. It's awesome. It grows here, so it must have figured out how to survive here. And I bet it's good for you. So maybe we don't need all of the food and all of the medicine from Peru or the Amazon, or, you know, maybe we don't need to take everything that somebody else has. So there's that part. And then there's also this like culture of celebrity within natural medicine. I mean, there are celebrities that report to have magical cures for all kinds of things and have fancy websites and, you know, attached clothing and jewelry lines to go with it. And they're selling a lifestyle, they're selling a brand, but they're co-opting basic knowledge that like shouldn't be so exotic. You know, and so I find myself in my work, I mean, I have an apothecary, right? So anybody can walk in, and there are herbs there and there are tinctures there. And if there's something that makes sense for me to put together for you, I will do that. But I more often than not send people out with a list of questions instead of a bag full of medicine. And the reason that I do that is because if I've just met you and I don't even know your name, I probably shouldn't be quote unquote treating you for your very complicated chronic health condition. And if you want to search Sugar Pills Yelp reviews, you'll find any number of people who are really pissed off at me because I didn't throw something over the counter at them for something that they'd already seen 500 experts for over the course of their entire life. It's inappropriate. But maybe what I did was ask you, how do you feel about this? And what have you done? And what are you willing to do? And what little things might we change? And it takes patience to heal. And so I feel like one of the most important things that I have to offer people is, again, just to learn to take time to listen. And maybe in the course of a conversation I have, something will occur to me like, this plant might be really useful for you in this moment in time, or this combination of herbs might be really useful for this acute thing that's happening for you right now. But if we're going to delve into something that's more chronic, I'm going to need a lot more information. And that's going to require you to take stock of everything you know about this, because you're the person that knows. And that, you know, going back to my learning about my own body, that was the thing that was so transformational for me, that somebody took the time to ask me, what do you know about this thing that your body is doing? Tell me everything. No doctor had ever asked me. They just kept throwing things at me and were like, try this and come back if it doesn't work. And it never worked because nobody ever asked me, when does this happen? What's it connected to? Like, how do you feel about it? What is it doing to you? How do you feel when it's happening? Like, nobody asked me any questions about me. They just looked at the thing that was happening and prescribed based on their diagnosis of that symptom. But nobody asked me how I was. When somebody finally did, it was life-changing. And we were able to find remedies that helped over time. And it took some time and a lot of patience. But I also had to learn how to be a patient. And I had to learn how to be patient and not expect this thing that had plagued me my whole life to change in a week or so.
Mm-hmm.
It took a good 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
But then 30 years have gone by since, and I don't suffer from that anymore because it got healed.
Mm-hmm.
And not everything can be healed completely, but we can learn to live with things and manage them and decrease our suffering. And I think that was what I got from my time in social work, going back to that background. Like, I was working in the field of domestic violence. So everybody was afraid, and everybody had been traumatized, and everyone had been injured, and nobody had the resources they needed. So there wasn't going to be any real health in that environment. But we could decrease suffering. We could do harm reduction, and we could manage some suffering enough to get somebody to where they could even think about what to do next if we just took the time, And I really was moved by how much suffering there was and how little time there was given to anybody to just catch their breath.
Yeah.
They had to move on and completely change their whole life because they were being hunted down. And everybody was on so many medications all the time, but nobody was being given the opportunity. And I just found that so profoundly disturbing, and it had everything to do with resource and culture and what is and is not available to some people,
This is where I want to cough and say capitalism, but capitalism. As we were prepping for the show, we were talking about how plants as remedies have characteristics or have qualities to them, and that if you're not treating the condition or the diagnosis or the disease, or you're treating the person. And so can you talk a little bit about how, A, B, C constituents of a plant don't necessarily equate to like a DEF impact on a person?
Yeah, for sure. Let's take the sexy plant of the moment, which is cannabis. Right? So in our part of the world, cannabis is legal, and anybody can get cannabis all of the time. And because it's been decriminalized, there are some people making money hand over fist now above board selling this plant when there's a whole bunch of people still in jail for selling that plant before it was legal. Yeah. And if you think about how powerful this plant is and how much desire there is for it and how much commerce there is around it and how much energy it holds, we're talking about something really powerful, right? Like there's a life force to this plant. And we've taken it apart now, and we've looked at different constituents from THC to CBD to CBN, and that's all well and good. But because it's legal now, and because it's being marketed in particular ways, everybody wants it. And everybody thinks it's going to be the thing that makes their suffering go away, whether it's insomnia or pain or anxiety or whatever it is. And for some people, that's true. But the thing about cannabis is, just like any other plant, it may or may not be your plant. And it may or may not be your plant at a particular time. And I learned about cannabis when I was younger because I was smoking weed. I thought that was real nice for a while until it wasn't. And I realized that I had been self-medicating with cannabis, which, when I was using it, when I was younger and I was using it, it was so damn strong. We were smoking ditchweed. We were smoking high CBD, really low THC, not really valuable ditchweed, which is what's being sold now as like, high CBD smoke, but it was very calming to me until it wasn't. And when it wasn't any longer, I did what most people do, is I started using more. And the more I used, the more anxious I got and the more paranoid I got. And I finally realized, oh my God, it's the plant. It's telling me to put it down. And when I just stopped smoking it, I felt so much better. And I'll tell you what else didn't work when I stopped smoking pot was I couldn't drink coffee anymore. Because I had been holding myself in this weird neurological balance of uppers and downers. I was drinking a shit ton of coffee and smoking a shit ton of pot. And I thought I had achieved this incredible equilibrium. But not, it was not okay. And when I took one part of that equation out, the other part didn't work. And I realized how strong both of those drugs were. So
right.
strong.
And coffee is, a plant the same way cannabis is a plant. Coffee is a bean.
Yeah. And where coffee offers a certain level of exuberance, cannabis is kind of a downer for most people. Mm-hmm. And so even on that level, it was sort of an equilibrium until it wasn't. Mm-hmm. And so what I've seen, especially since cannabis became legal, is people are using it so much. And then they start using more and more and more because they feel like it stops working. And sometimes you just got to listen to the plant when it's telling you, like, I'm not your plant right now. Put me down. Stop. Just stop.
Lay off.
I'm doing this to you. Yeah. And so again, that's part of that listening is sometimes people will come into the apothecary, and one of the things I always ask them is, what are you already doing for this X, Y, and Z thing you've asked me for help? Yeah. And because so much of my day is spent talking about people's combo pack of depression, anxiety, and insomnia, 9 times out of 10 in Seattle right now, somebody has tried cannabis. Yeah. And so once we start talking about it and we dig in a little bit, most people will hear themselves say, well, I started using cannabis and it worked for a while, and then it sort of didn't work so well, so I started using something stronger and it's not working. And I'm like, well, what if we just try a week without cannabis? Yeah. Just try, just see how it feels. Don't change anything else. And just see how it feels, and then come back and let's talk some more. Yeah. And almost always, if people really do it, they learn some things about themselves, and maybe they learned that it really was helping and they're really not okay without it. And it really is their plant. Like my partner, man, cannabis is her plant. It is her plant. Like, and no matter what is happening, whether it's like incredible, she has some digestive problems that are really intractable, and cannabis works for her like nothing else. Amazing. And if her mind is spinning out, it works for her. For me, exact opposite. It does not have that effect on me. It makes everything worse. So, whether or not something is purported to be good for X, Y, and Z, doesn't mean it's going to be good for you. Right. Like, maybe it is, but maybe something else would be better. And maybe we have to try a couple of things and one thing at a time until we find the one or the combination of things that really suit you.
I have to tell the story about meeting you. I don't remember initially. I think a patient must have told me about you or about sugar pill or something. And I remember walking in, and I think this is either in 2000. I think it was, when did you open?
I opened in 2011.
I think this was in 2012 or early 2013. And I walked in and we were talking about bitters. And you had a little basket of bitters with like 20 different kinds in there. And you had me taste them. And I thought, oh my God, this is so bitter and disgusting. And you said, try bitters. It will change your life. And in my mind, I was like, this lady's crazy and nothing is going to happen. But I wanted, I tried to be polite. And so I took them home, and lo and behold, it changed my life. I could feel the bitters in my body doing the thing that I had been waiting for my whole life, which is to help my digestion clarify from the inside out. And I truly did feel like when my digestion got up to speed or got running on a better track, it was like somehow I had just taken the shoes out of the dryer and now it was just humming. Now it was just a hum. And the mental clarity that came with improved digestion, which I had known about for, since the late 90s, studying Ayurveda. I'd used Triphala for a long time, which is a classic Ayurvedic digestion herb. But somehow there was something about bitters, which have the properties of being both carminative in terms of increasing digestive power, but not being heating necessarily. I mean, some bitters can have heating things in them, but the flavor of that is a bitter flavor tends to be cooling. All of those things just made my belly hum and helped my mind to hum. And so I went from being like, this lady's crazy, I will take home bitters out of politeness, I will never use them, in 10 years I'll throw them away because they've gone stale, to being like a total devotee of you and of the bitters. And so in the years since, I've sent so many patients to see you and have talked a lot about bitters. And I will tell you, there is a high percentage of patients, which now no longer surprises me, but which, come from seeing GI specialists who have been on all kinds of medications, that then what helps their belly to unwind and unlock is just bitter herbs, bitters. So can you talk a little bit about bitters?
Absolutely.
Power of bitters?
Thank you for being so polite way back then. I think there's a lot of people that have that experience of just humoring me and being like, okay, sure, fine. That reminds me of when I went to a naturopath for the first time ever, and she was like, I need you to eat beets every day for the next 3 months. And I was like, oh, sure, fine. But then I did it. And it really helped me. And I came back and she asked me, well, what have you done? And I was like, well, I did everything you told me. And I ate beets every day for 3 months. And she was like, you did? Me too. And she's like, yeah, but nobody ever does it.
I know. Yep.
My journey with bitters has been really fun. And I think you met me right at the time when it was sort of an epiphany for me, which is probably why I went off on it too. But I will tell you that I owe a lot of my knowledge of and love for bitters. I owe a lot of that to an herbalist named Guido Masse. And Guido he's one of my favorite herbalists, and he is one of the co-formulators of my favorite brand of bitters, which is Urban Moonshine.
Yes, that's the one I recommend.
Yeah, it's such a great company. Guido and Jovial King, who started that company, they just kept their formulas really simple but really smart. And I took a bunch of classes with Guido over the years, and I'm going to paraphrase the way that he talked about bitters, but it changed everything. It changed the way I practice herbalism, because he made this very deep connection for me that nobody had ever made for me before. And what he taught me, as a budding herbalist, I knew, like, if you taste something bitter, then something happens and you break your food down better and it stimulates some things in your gallbladder, your liver, or whatever, but I didn't really know why. And what Guido taught me was, because again, we evolved with plants. We have always had a relationship to plants, and some of those plants are poisonous. And a lot of the poisonous plants have alkaloids in them, which tend to have a very bitter flavor. So as humans were evolving alongside these plants, the beings that could taste the bitterness in really small quantities were the ones who flinched and stopped eating the poisonous plant sooner, so it didn't kill them.
Interesting.
And so that sensitivity to bitterness became really heightened over time because it was protective. It was a way that our sensory body told us, hey, you might want to put that down or you're going to die. So that's why we taste bitterness so intensely, and why so many people dislike it so much, because we're supposed to. It makes us flinch and think about whether or not we want to continue to do that. And some people are super tasters and have a particularly hard time with that flavor. But the thing is, when you taste that flavor of bitterness, not only does it get your attention, but it also lights up all these mechanisms within the body to protect you from that poison that you might have ingested. So your body immediately starts making all these chemicals that neutralize poisons, and also PS help you break down your food correctly. So after all of this time of evolving with this relationship to that flavor, if we don't taste the flavor of bitterness, there's all kinds of things that don't happen in the body, because we're hardwired to respond in a particular way. And that response doesn't occur unless the bitterness is present. So in the typical Western diet, there's very few things that are bitter, and the bitter things, we tend to throw sugar on top of them. So coffee's bitter, but we put cream and sugar in it, right? Like cocoa's bitter, but we put sugar in it. And, greens are bitter, but we put salad dressing on it. Like, we disguise it to make it more palatable instead of the benefit of the bitter coming through. And if you look at a well-stocked bar, all of those fancy liqueurs back there that are bitter, that's just people making medicine more palatable. But there's a reason that those aperitifs and digestifs show up with that name on the menu.
Yes.
An aperitif is something that stimulates your appetite. When you eat something bitter, your body starts to prepare itself to receive food and break it down. And so it actually stimulates your appetite. A digestif taken after a meal does the same thing and gives your body that extra little boost so that you break down that food better and you don't have agita, you know? One of my favorite things to teach people who run restaurants is put something bitter in the menu so that when everybody eats this amazing meal, they don't feel like crap when they get home and they want to come back and do it again.
Yeah.
It's going to help them, you know? And so the other thing that I think that is super interesting about bitters is that we start to crave them. The more, like you had that experience, you hated them at first, but the more you have it, the more you want it because it does this beneficial thing and it re-educates your body how to do what it's supposed to do. And I think, you know, what Western science has given us that's really precious is that we've been able to discover now that there are bitterness receptors all over your body. They're not just in your digestive tract.
And they're not just like on your tongue or in your mouth.
Yeah, and they're all the way through your digestive tract, which you also have nervous system cells that are emotional, you know, so the better your digestion is, the more balanced your emotions are. But we've also got bitterness receptors in our lungs. We've got them in our brain. We've got them around the pericardium of the heart. They're everywhere. When you taste that, even if you don't know it, it's stimulating your immune system. It's stimulating your nervous system. In most traditional medicines, you're meant to taste that medicine. You are meant to take those herbs and cook them, and it's going to be nasty, and you're going to have to kind of gack it down. But what you don't want to do is disguise it and bypass that reception of that information, because say you have something really intense going on in your lungs and the prescription is these really, really bitter herbs. The herbs are going to work in a variety of ways, but one of the ways they're going to work is when that bitterness hits your mouth, it's going to light up the bitterness receptors in your lungs, and that's going to stimulate a very specific immune response that's going to help your body heal itself. So when we bypass all of that, we miss some of the magic of the medicine. So it made me more willing to interact with plants. I was kind of a wimp before then. I was like, I don't want to drink that. But I'll tell you what, I had pneumonia, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. And a naturopath prescribed antibiotics for me. And I was like, no, I want to trust our medicine. I get that you can prescribe antibiotics, but don't you have anything else to offer me? Like, I know there's herbs that work for this, but I need you to hold my hand because this isn't going to be easy. And she wouldn't do it. So I went to an acupuncturist. And it took a good 6 weeks. And I had to go every 3 days and get a different updated prescription of what herbs he thought were going to be useful based on what had changed and what hadn't changed by then. And I'll tell you what, that was the worst tasting anything I have ever had in my life. But it worked. And I haven't really been sick since then. Like
amazing.
I've had like 2 colds and maybe 1 bout of flu in the last 20 years. And I 100% ascribe that to the fact that I live with plants and I live with trusting that. And I know when to ask for help. I have a doctor. Like if I have something that isn't responding to something natural, I'm not going to just go on. I mean, I have done this and I've gotten myself into some trouble because I'm stubborn, but there's a time and a place for every kind of medicine. But I'm so fortunate that I had somebody who trusted the medicine enough and was willing to spend the time and the effort with me. And that I was willing to spend the time and be patient enough with my body to let this run its course, because on the other side of it, I was so much stronger, but it took a long time. And I couldn't have done it alone. I needed somebody to hold my hand. It didn't matter that I knew that there were plants that would help me. I was sick and I needed somebody to walk me through it. And I was really lucky that there was somebody that was willing to do that.
Amazing. So we've really covered a lot today. You are just incredible. And hearing your stories and even where you've come from and what you've learned and how you've been able to reconnect yourself, even though that wasn't part of the tradition of how you were raised connected to the earth, that you have gone out and developed these relationships with the plants, and that has been really the venue through which you've connected with yourself with people, with community, with places. It really makes it that any of us can do that.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Let me say one thing in response to that too, which I think is really important, is there's no right way to do this.
Uh-huh.
If you were to come into my apothecary today, you would discover that I am not the person to walk through a landscape with who's going to tell you what each plant is. Mm-hmm. I am also not the person that's going to tell you what the chemical constituents are.
Uh-huh.
And I think there's an idea that you have to know everything about plants in order to interact with them. I mean, I have taught in an herbal program at a revered natural health institute, but I didn't know jack shit about chemical constituents. And I also do not know how to key out a plant in the wild. And so I had a lot of students who, dismissed me as, you're not an herbalist, you don't know this. And I'm like, no, I don't know that, but I know some other things. And that's what I'm here to teach you. And there's going to be other people who are going to teach you chemistry and plant biology. And I wish I knew all that, but that wasn't what my training was. That's not how I learned it. And so there are huge gaps in my knowledge, and there always will be. But I have the sense and the wherewithal to practice within the scope of my own knowledge. And I think that's the most important thing any of us can learn as practitioners or as, just, a hobbyist. Like, if you can be honest about what you know and what you don't know, and you set out to cause no harm, and you don't get ahead of yourself, and you don't use this language as something to like bolster your ego about how important you are in the world, then you can do really good work. And if all you know is one plant, but you know it really well, and you know when to use it and when not to use it, you're an herbalist. You don't have to know every single thing about every single plant. But what you do need to know is how to not harm somebody by using knowledge that you don't really have. So I think that one of the most important things that any of us can learn is how to say, I don't know. Let's find somebody who does. Because I don't know everything. Oh my God, there's so much I don't know. But I know what I do know, and I know when to stop. And that's why I have so many unsatisfied customers who are like, I came here for you to fix this. And I'm like, I'm not the right person to do that. Maybe sometimes I am, but my desire and why I put myself in a little brick and mortar in the middle of a city. I'm not out in the country, harvesting for you. I'm in a little brick and mortar store on one of the busiest corners in Seattle. And what I can do for you is to help you listen to the language of your own body and ask really good questions of yourself and ask really good questions of your practitioners so that you're a good advocate for yourself. And if I can teach you about some plants, that's great. But there are so many other parts of this job that are more useful, I think, sometimes. And because I have a storefront and because anybody can walk in, then I'm accessible in a way that I wouldn't be otherwise. And, it's not the sexiest job and it's not a lucrative job, that's for sure. But it's so satisfying to see somebody light up to ask a question that they're like, oh my God, nobody ever asked me that before. When they hear themselves answer it and now they have the answer to their own question. It's beautiful to me. It's so exciting.
It is. And for all of you listening who are in Seattle, you should absolutely go see Karyn at Sugar Pill on Capitol Hill. And if you're not in Seattle, or even if you're in Seattle but not actually in Karyn's apothecary, then you should be checking out her Instagram. You are just such a gem in our community and in the world. And thank you so much for being on this show with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. It was great.
And thank you all for listening with Karyn Schwartz, herbalist, a community herbalist at the Sugar Pill Apothecary. We've got lots of ways to continue this conversation through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can get more information from and about Karyn at her store or us we do have a website, centerforhealingneurology.com. Please be sure to share this show with your friends. We welcome your rating and review wherever you get your podcasts, and feel free to send topic requests to podcast@centerforhealingneurology.com. We love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. We rise or fall together, and we're committed to doing what we can to make as many of us as healthy as possible. And this takes all of us, including you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Party Fish Media.
Partyfish Media acknowledges that it operates and records on indigenous Duwamish and Puget Sound Coast Salish land that is still home to the Duwamish tribe. This land is stolen in violation of the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and community members from these nations who reside alongside us. For more information on this land, its people, or ways you can help, visit duwamishtribe.org.